Welcome to the Freight Project podcast, brought to you by Ceresys, a North American third-party logistics company providing shippers transportation management technology and solutions.
On today's The Freight Project podcast episode, I welcome Peter Tirschwell, Senior Director of Content at the Journal of Commerce. Peter and I will talk about the state of decarbonization of freight, with the main focus of those efforts on container shipping. Peter will give his vast wisdom on the topic after having covered the industry on the front lines for 30 years. Peter will also address what's coming up for this year's TPM conference, now celebrating its 20th year of existence, held in Long Beach, California, in March of next year. I hope you enjoy this episode of the Freight Project Podcast. Well, hello, Peter. Welcome to the Freight Project Podcast. It's really an honor to have your voice on the podcast today and really impart your wisdom upon our listeners. I think you have a really great, unique voice. And before we get into the subject today, I want to make sure our listeners know who you are and your background in this space and what you're doing now.
Great, Adam. Happy to be with you today, and really looking forward to your questions and to our dialogue. So I lead the Journal of Commerce, it was the historic daily shipping newspaper of New York City that was founded in 1827 by Samuel Morse. It was a daily newspaper until the year 2000, when the business model transitioned into a magazine, website, and a conference business. So the year 2001 was when TPM was first created, which is now the world's largest container shipping conference. And we're a team of specialized journalists who are very, deeply connected into the container and intermodal and trucking worlds. And we report daily on the Journal of Commerce website and in our magazine. And we also build conference programs directly out of our journalism. And for the last 5 years, we've been part of IHS Markit, which is a global data technology and subject matter expertise business. So we feel very comfortable that we're within a business that's very neutral, very unbiased, and that's the type of environment that we like to work in.
Well, that's good, and I can attest to the quality of some of these events. I was fortunate to be on a panel invited by your lead technology journalist, Mr. Eric Johnson, to Log Tech 2019 back in September. A tremendous time. Got to learn a lot and meet a lot of good new people. So for our listeners out there, I highly encourage you check out the events that the Journal of Commerce team is putting out. And, you mentioned just the history of the newspaper and the publication and kind of that migration towards events and online. And, I experienced that firsthand working at Gannett at the Pensacola News Journal, where we transitioned, from that newspaper world to that online. And, it's an interesting world. There's so much information out there today. It's almost an information overload. We're putting out content at Ceresys. You're putting out there at Journal of Commerce. There's publications popping up all the time. And it's really probably hard. I kind of feel empathetic for the shipper out there, right? They have so many corporate goals to reach, so many things to do in shipping that are tough in and of their own right. But I think that's why it's important to have you on today, Peter, because someone who has really seen this industry, from a long time ago to today and the rapid changes we've seen, especially in the last 5 years, you have a really good, perch to view the industry, as you said, from that objective, fact-based stance. And now another beyond disruption because of technology, one of the big things that we're also facing are these geopolitical market forces, regulations, trade wars. It's tough out there for a shipper. And one of those things that's upcoming is the IMO 2020. Now, that's the International Maritime Organization requiring vessels to use lower sulfur bunkering fuel, and that goes into effect on January 1st of 2020. So that brings us to something that you've been really taking a look at, and I think is important that we talk about because it's starting to happen now, and that's decarbonization of container shipping. So with all of that said, let's first understand really what that means so we don't take for granted what our audience knows. What do you define as decarbonization of container shipping?
Well, it's a great question and increasingly very timely. You mentioned the IMO 2020, which is the low sulfur fuel requirement that takes effect on January 1. And that has essentially nothing to do with decarbonization. It all has to do with sulfur content. And sulfur emissions from fuel are the culprit in all sorts of human health issues, and so it was an important step to take. But it really said that the world community, speaking through the UN, in turn speaking through the IMO, is knocking ever louder on the door of the shipping industry to clean up its act. And so in a way, the sulfur cap, which is going to take place or is going to be implemented in just over a month, is really the prelude to what's coming. So the sulfur cap will involve a transition period. The costs that shippers incur for containerized shipping are going to go up to a certain degree, maybe 10%, 10 to 15%, something like that. There will be some hiccups over the next year as the market for low sulfur fuel settles down and so forth. But the next big challenge that the industry is going to face is around decarbonization. And it's going to happen sooner and faster than I think many people realize. And the reason for that is that a couple things have happened. In 2018, the IMO stated a initial greenhouse gas strategy. They agreed upon it. And that strategy says that absolute CO2 emissions from shipping will be reduced by 50% by 2050 compared to 2008 levels. And what was interesting about that was, first of all, that the IMO, which is just a group of countries that agreed to it, so the countries had to agree, and they did. But actually, you had industry players who decided that was insufficient and have made commitments that go far and beyond that. And in particular, I refer to Maersk, the world's largest container shipping company, which said that, and this wasn't long after the IMO made its commitment, Maersk said that it will essentially have a fully decarbonized fleet by that same date, 2050. So while the IMO said that they were going to reduce emissions by 50% compared to 2008 levels, Maersk said that they're going to be fully decarbonized by 2050. Now, what that means is that in order to do that, because ships have a 20-year plus lifespan, you can't achieve that unless the first fully decarbonized vessel, zero carbon ship, is on the water operating by 2030. Well, we're going to, in 5 weeks from now, 6 weeks from now, we're going to be it's going to be 2020. So in 10 years, the research and the fuel sources are going to have to evolve to the point that it's going to be possible to have a fully decarbonized ship on the water. That type of vessel does not exist today. The technology does not exist. There are many different ideas about how that's going to be achieved. And so what we're going to see, Adam, is a very intensive decade of R&D, experimentation, different companies trying different ideas in order to get us to the point where you can have not just a zero carbon ship on the water by 2030, but one that is commercially viable, because, it's possible to run ships with certain fuels like ammonia, but just to take one possibility, one possible fuel that has been identified, you can do that. But is it going to be anywhere at scale? Is the fuel going to be available? Are the ports going to be available and set up for bunkering? These are all questions that are very much unanswered. as of this point, and actually a decade when it comes to figuring out something this big, a decade is not a long time at all.
Well, no, it's not. And I've seen 10 years fly by, and especially if you have children. I have a 13-year-old at this point, and I have no idea where those 10 years went. So I just think about, as you describe that, it's going to be a heck of a lot of collaboration between a lot of parties around freight in order for that to happen. And as you said, the key word is commercially viable. That means making it profitable, because I don't think anybody really goes into this without wanting to make a profit, whether you're a 3PL, a carrier line like Maersk, or, a shipper who's trying to manufacture and get your products out the door to customers. So how do you think this is going to happen then? How are we going to have shippers, one, who are in the middle of this technological revolution where APIs are starting to bring in real-time rates, from port to drayage, and, truckers are dealing with various things around how to switch between modes because of e-commerce and final mile, where before it was, fax in your order and you could be okay on an LTL freight shipment waiting for 4 to 5 days, where speed becomes the most ultimate metric to satisfy the customer, all while not having to lose your bottom line and go bankrupt. I mean, what do shippers, what do 3PLs, what do carrier lines need to do in order to work together to achieve this in 10 years? It seems almost impossible.
Well, what I've been describing here is really what's happening on the water in the container shipping world. I think that when you get onto the land, you have a whole different set of considerations in the sense that you've got national goals, because now when you are within the United States or within Germany or any individual country, you're now falling under the laws and policies and strategy of individual countries, and those vary greatly. You have some Scandinavian countries that have hugely ambitious decarbonization goals, 80%, by 2050, 2040. I mean, just where they go so far and beyond any other countries, and those policies are going to spur the development of zero carbon vehicles and other means of transportation like rail, where you're going to see more electrification, for example. And on the water, what is really interesting is that the initiative really is being led by the carrier. So there are shippers who are very much out in front of the pack on advocating for decarbonization, but they are in shipping, but they are relatively few and far between. And as a percent of the cargo that is shipped, they're tiny. For many years at TPM, the TPM conference will be 20 years this coming March in Long Beach. Over 20 years, we've done any number of panels on this subject. And the common characteristic to those is that nobody shows up. We have a huge room that's virtually empty. And, you've got credible people up on stage saying, look, this is coming. This is a global problem. Our world is at risk, and we got to do something about it. And the level of interest is quite low. And this year, we're going to elevate that dialogue by having a panel which is going to be in front of the main audience in one of the morning sessions, so a very large audience. And the reason is that the time has come to now discuss this. And we have on that, just to give an example of the level of seniority of people who are willing to talk about this, IKEA will be participating, because IKEA is probably the one shipper that is the one really big shipper that I think is probably ahead of almost everybody else on this issue. And then we would have this Jeremy Nixon, the CEO of One, as well as Otto Schacht, who heads the ocean business for Kuehne + Nagel, who's been among freight forwarders, has been very outwardly proactive on this issue. It was very interesting that Kuehne + Nagel was advocating at the last meeting of the IMO Environmental Committee in, I believe, April or May of 2019, basically advocating for mandatory slow steaming of vessels, because that is a way to, in a way, very easily reduce carbon emissions from shipping without having to change any ships, without having to use any different fuel, without having to do anything. Kuninaga, which is the largest global ocean freight forwarder, they're the number one in the ocean world, basically saying, yeah, this is a good idea, even though the ocean carriers like Maersk and all the others acting as a group are totally opposed to this, because they think that furthermore, I mean, just to begin with, container shipping speeds have declined 25% already over the last decade, largely as a cost-saving measure. So they think that speeds have come down quite a bit. They've really strained supply chains. You mentioned in the e-commerce world how speed is everything these days, and that is the ocean transit times are going in the opposite direction, basically. So we're getting to the point here, Adam, where it's really becoming real time, where this issue is really starting to be discussed. And there are other issues. I mean, there are other developments happening. The banks that lend on vessels to build new vessels or to finance vessels are now putting into place standards that they're all going to agree on, where they are going to take into consideration the carbon footprint of the vessel when making lending decisions. And then you see the Global Maritime Forum, which is kind of like a Davos for the shipping industry, which is the most senior level annual gathering of shipping industry leaders, took place a couple of weeks ago in Singapore. And out of that meeting came a commitment to a carbon levy on shipping. So if there's a carbon levy on shipping, then what that's going to result in is a multi-billion-dollar research and investment fund, which is going to help to answer these questions of what's the best fuel, what are the best means of bunkering, all the sort of different technology questions that need to be answered. So, it seems that things are really on the move. But what is interesting, though, just to say this, is that a lot of it seems to be driven by the vendors, by the ocean carriers. This is on the ocean side versus the shippers. I really am not perceiving huge, overwhelming pressure coming on the ocean carriers from their customers. The pressure on them seems to be much greater in terms of coming from the global population of the global community speaking through the UN and that pressure coming to bear on the IMO, rather than, hey, I ship 1 million TEUs a year and I demand that you do this, because actually 1 million TEUs a year may be a very large customer, but actually as a percent of total cargo is very small.
Yeah. And it sounds like, for me, from my perspective, as I hear you kind of lay that out, it really stresses the importance on both carriers, shippers, and the forwarders and brokers and 3PLs in between to make other parts of their operations much more efficient, much more real time, and much more predictive. If you're going to slow down ships or change the way in which ships are constructed or how they're used, or maybe even fees might be added if a ship doesn't, meet a certain standard, or maybe in the future a truck, it sounds like planning is going to become such an important aspect of freight, because time is not going to slow down, and it's going to be really tough to put the genie back in the bottle of the end customer's expectations when it comes to speed of delivery. Some of these manufacturers need that speed for their own manufacturing schedules, whether it's on the inbound side or, the customer can go somewhere else if another shipper's figured it out. Smart on IKEA to do so. And for them to be leaders, they're looking at the forest and they see the trees. Some people are maybe missing the forest for the trees. And is there a modicum of resetting of expectations, or is it, hey, the expectations are there, instead of, worrying about the speed of the ship or or other factors. Let's get our other parts that are inefficient in order. So what are you seeing there?
Well, for sure. And in a subject like that, we diverge a little bit from, a decarbonization discussion, which really has to do with, the fuel and how shipping is going to meet the IMO goals, and the IMO goals are aligned with the UN Paris climate change goals. But yeah, I mean, on the ocean side, you are seeing a number of things happen. Ships are slowing down. The container ships have slowed down 25% over the last decade. They're not speeding up. The resistance of major shippers to be paying more for ocean transportation remains as intense as it ever was. So on one hand, you've got these sort of, diametrically opposed forces that are engaged in hand-to-hand combat on a yearly basis, which is that when you are a retail company or a consumer product company and you are trying to meet the expectations of the e-commerce supply chain, you are telling your transportation vendors, I desperately need visibility. I desperately need reliability. In some cases, I need more speed out of the ships. And the degree to which the industry overall is able to meet those expectations is still relatively limited. And especially because if you are a major company that is, selling shoes or selling furniture or selling, some other consumer product, whether importing it through their, your own supply chain network or relying on vendors, who are in turn, experiencing the pressures that you're putting on them. You want to be like a UPS customer. I mean, a UPS customer has, if you send me a package on UPS, well, and you give me the tracking number, I can track it. Are you paying any more money to UPS to create the visibility that you can then provide to me as your receiver? No, they're providing that, as part of their basic service. Well, if that's the case, then how is this disconnect going to be resolved where you have various players in the supply chain who want to be paid for visibility and people on the buy side who don't want to pay for it, and this is very much yet to be resolved in the bigger picture.
Yeah, it's a fat word, isn't it? That visibility word. And it can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, whether it's visibility into real-time rates, whether it's visibility to the shipment level. You have companies like Four Kites coming out here with different things. You have hardware providers who are working more in the cellular space, like Tive Inc., with Krinar Kamani, who I just recently had on the podcast. You have several companies trying to achieve this and come at it from a technological standpoint. But I also have to think about reality, right? There's a couple of forces that I think are interesting in this industry. The first one is that when I came into it 7 years ago, I was very surprised at it still not being technologically disrupted, that it was still sort of a manual process, that even TMS adoption rates were fairly low 7 years ago. But in the last, say, 3 years, and maybe Bradley Jacobs kicked this off with XPO, but the acquisition after acquisition, the surge in VC money in freight tech, for visibility solutions or things like machine learning. And now we're starting to see blockchain. But then the second force that's really hard to overcome, and this is no different than today or maybe even 50 years ago, but maybe it's difficult because of today's political environment, right? We're all more globalized as a society, but at the same time, we're seeing this claw back a little bit to some nationalism. And there's a lot of coordination, not just amongst the players, but as you mentioned, these countries, right? So how do we set the realistic expectations that we can achieve this? Are you hopeful, or what's your outlook? Do you think it's going to happen?
Well, obviously we watch technology very closely, and there are some ventures, some startups who seem to be making some traction. But as to, and we've written this, we've reported on it, we've written analysis and commentary on this, that is pointing out the very low level of actual disruption that is occurring. Disruption being incumbent players being displaced by upstarts who have reorganized the market, brought to bear technology that is on at a level of adoption of, say, an Uber, who would be, disrupting local taxi fleets, for example. We've yet to see that. Now, to a certain degree, in the domestic truck brokerage world, I think that it's not unfair to say that the incumbents are probably under greater pressure. Certainly, nobody has disrupted the container carriers. Nobody has disrupted the international 3PLs. Now, at the Journal of Commerce, we are focusing mostly on the international supply chain, although we've got a couple of terrific writers, Bill Cassidy and Ari Ash, who know more about trucking than almost any journalist out there.
Two fantastic guys, I must say.
Indeed, they are. A great pleasure for me to work with them. And so, but we're there seems to be a great deal more noise on the VC financing front than there is on the actual disruption front. And that's because, to a certain degree, that budgets are tight, shippers are tight-fisted, they are not satisfied with a lot of solutions that have come in the past. And to be honest with you, a lot of the real problems that exist in the international supply chain, particularly on the container side, are, as it stands right now, unsolved. The ship schedule reliability remains fairly atrocious. Visibility at marine terminals and the actual ability to get trucks in and out of terminals without lengthy wait times, and being able to pick up chassis and actually create a very smooth, consistent flow of containers through marine terminals at the port of LA and Long Beach or any others remains highly, highly challenging. So with all the technology that has been created, all the VC money that has been invested, all the startups that have that are out there, the level of inefficiency remains very, very high. And as that happens, as that continues year after year, the level of skepticism grows. So change will come. It is coming, but it's a lot slower than some people think it will be.
Oh yeah. Well, it was funny. I was talking to an ocean visibility company or data company called Ocean Insights the other day.
Yep, I was
just picking their brain. Yeah, I was just picking their brain about demurrage costs. And, they were talking about, they had a customer that had shipped 403 containers, and of those 433, 144 went past the allotted 8 free days. And on average, they incurred 5 days over those 8 free days at, let's say, $125 per day per container. And it was something like $72,000 just for those 144 containers in demurrage fees. That's a heck of a lot of money and that's just for one quarter for one shipper. And that might not even be a massive shipper. And so you're talking about $250,000 a year going away from the bottom line. And Ocean Insights doesn't necessarily solve it per se. They just give you that information so you can start to solve it. And so we're getting better with metrics, but I mean, goodness, right? Think about your Fitbit or these step trackers. Think about if all it did was, really the Fitbit doesn't do anything but track your steps. It doesn't actually make you go on the treadmill or take a jog. So there's a lot to be said. And I think just bringing in the visibility will help, but it's going to be a lot of good collaborative work. And so decarbonization, let's look out for it. We got to focus on it. It's going to be at TPM 2020, or when's the TPM show?
Yep. The TPM will be March 1 through 4th in Long Beach, and it'll be the 20th anniversary this year.
Ooh, Woo! Class reunion. Do we get any cool rings or anything?
Good question. We got some surprises underway. We're going to announce our keynote speaker right after Thanksgiving, and that's going to be it's going to be a big announcement. So I think we've got a really great event in the works, and there's nothing like there's nothing like this conference. It's the most exhausting week for literally several thousand people at this point of the year. So you can already feel the excitement beginning to build.
Well, we'll be following along. We'll have to support you with a tweet or two for sure, my friend Peter.
Much appreciated.
But I want to thank you. Yeah, I want to thank you so much for coming on to the Freight Project podcast. We really appreciate your thoughts, and we look forward to seeing how the conversations go with decarbonization. If anything, this industry's not boring. I think if you're not in it, you might view it as boring, but there's a heck of a lot of things going on. So for all of our listeners out there on the Freight Project podcast, we want to thank you each week for tuning in to our expert voices, and you have a good one.